Um, Hello and welcome to the show. Welcome to another episode of my summer series. And I'm joined today by somebody who interviewed me about 8 months ago, something like that. It was back
About
like,
that. Yeah.
yeah, back when we were all different people. Well, for one, you didn't have a very bushy beard back then, so
No,
that's
I have embraced my inner druid, apparently. This is what people keep telling me now. My hair is slightly longer, my beard is getting there now. I'm slowly becoming Dumbledore in my old age.
it's wonderful. Old age,
Old
20.
age, yeah.
Whatever. So I'm going to introduce my guest here. This is Chris Lyon. Chris Lyon is, let me find what I've written down for you here. Chris Lyon hails from Rochester, United Kingdom, which is just east of London, for those who are not from the United Kingdom. His academic background includes a BA in archaeology from UCL, University College London, and training as a life business coach. Chris is the founder and director of Mystai, a community focused on deeper studying of the esoteric arts. And as part of Mystai, Chris hosts Into the Couldron podcast, which I was featured on. Chris is a lifelong practicing historical hermeticist and has training and connections of other traditions. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Ben. Lovely to be here.
Now, I've lost you. Where are you here? There you are. Okay. I was saying beforehand, we've been chatting for the past like hour and a half, actually.
Yeah.
And Zoom changed everything. So for a minute there, I lost you. But
Mm.
welcome so much. So Chris, you just literally got off the plane a few days ago from Tallinn, Estonia, and you're heading back out somewhere on Tuesday. So where are you heading, first of all?
Well, so I'm heading out to Catalonia on Tuesday. And it's quite, I know, for those of you who you guys can even see in the thing behind me, I have a copy of the Iliad and Odyssey up there. Homer is one of my favorite epic poets, or any kind of ancient Greek epic poetry is amazing to me. But one of the things, obviously, off the coast, it's about half an hour, 20-minute boat ride off the coast of Catalonia. There is the island of Ithaca. And those of you who've read the Odyssey obviously know that is Odysseus's palace. So it's the site of Odysseus's home. Now, it's quite a big thing for me because I studied classics. Well, as part of my archaeology degree, I studied classical texts throughout university. And when I did my A levels, I did classics and I studied the Iliad and Odyssey for 2-3 years. So it's quite an adventure and quite an interesting thing to actually go to the place that the Odyssey is set, right? And actually walk in that environment and be in that environment where, I mean, there are obviously historical kind of discrepancies and there are debates over whether modern Ithaca is the same as Homer's Ithaca and whether it's like a different island off the coast of Catalonia or whatever it is. But it's that, like, all of it is set around the island of Catalonia, right? Or set around that kind of area in the Aegean Sea. So it is quite a big deal for me having studied. I mean, these are also texts, my dad used to read me when I was a kid, when I was growing up, and it's quite a big deal for me to actually go to these places and be in these places, but like they're places I've read about in the epics, and now I'm actually going to be walking through. I'm going to be going there and actually being there in person, and I'm incredibly excited to, perform. Well, I don't know if I'd be doing, those of you who've read the Odyssey, I think it's book 10, where Odysseus does his whole sacrificial black ram ritual to go down into Hades. I'm not exactly, I won't be doing that, but I might try and find some caves and see what happens, see if I can find Circe in general, but
You never know, right? You never know. And it's a weird connection, actually, in thinking about it. One of my professors who I just took a classics course with last semester, Dr. Lisa Trenton, who I don't know if you've come across her work, but her major interests are in architecture, particularly. She's actually leading a group of Canadian students from a university over in mainland Greece in Ithaca right now. So you may actually come
I may
across.
run into her. Yeah, I can flash my archaeology ID and be like, let me on site. It'll be great.
Like, I know Ben, I was just interviewed by him.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So, okay, well, so let's start with that then, because
Hmm.
I think a lot of people who know me may have watched my interview with you, and we got a little bit into your spiritual background. But let's talk a little bit about then your connection between kind of your academic work and your spiritual background. Give us the story. Where did you start out, and what brought you to this place now?
Yeah. So, gosh, let's think. So I I say lifelong. I have been a lifelong practitioner in a manner of speaking, but I did start very, very young. So I am very privileged. I'm very grateful to have started my general kind of initiation into witchcraft, or my general kind of spiritual journey around the age of 10 or 11. And that was because my family has a bit of a background in witchcraft. They are very connected ancestrally to certain things, and I thankfully, in some manner of speaking, although the relationship didn't end very well, I did meet my mentor when I was around sort of 10, 11 years old, and we worked together for a good solid 6, 7 years, and I was taught or I was taught everything from traditional ceremonial magic and Goetia and all that kind of thing, leading more towards theurgy now that I've kind of fell into it a bit more as I've aged. But I was always fascinated with religion, and especially sort of the anthropological studies of religion. And especially one of the things that was the most interesting to me was how, if you look at it's some of like the more like niche anthropological texts, the ones that focus on magic and witchcraft, you have Evans Pritchard in his oracles among the Azande witchcraft, all that kind of thing, the early sort of the gift, things like that, with the Polynesian mana, Marcel Mauss, whatever, all these early anthropologists who are talking about interesting encounters and things that they have on their ethnography, on their field work. And it always fascinated me how these people, they would be having these incredible experiences when they were working with these tribes, or they were working with certain communities, and then we wouldn't be able to talk about them in academia, right? There is obviously a natural stigma around things like magic and religion, or not much around religion, but magic and anything kind of esoteric in the academy in general. Obviously it isn't, because magic isn't real, therefore you can't really talk about it. It's not a valid field of study. But I was fascinated by it. I was absolutely taken with it. And especially more than anything, I was, one of those kids who was always fascinated with ancient cultures, Egypt, Greece, whatever. And it one thing inevitably led to another, and I found myself sort of getting obsessed with archaeology. I as a kid, I was always, wearing the hats, wearing the trowel, everything, and going all over the place with it. And it was great. And I managed to sort of gear my general academic career towards focusing on archaeology. And that's where I got thankfully accepted into UCL, which was amazing. I studied most of archaeology in throughout UCL for sort of 4 years there. And during my time there, I took in a special focus initially, where I kind of went in focusing on Egypt, as most people, and Egyptology in UCL is very big. And it's one of those interesting things. Anyone who has kind of gone through university and had this kind of process will know what I'm talking about here. But you can think you love something so much until you start getting examined on it, and then you realize that actually you hate it. Like, you grow to hate it over time, because you realize like it kind of just sucks all the excitement and joy out of it when you're like, there's so much stress and pressure on you to perform in examinations and essays and all this kind of thing. So I kind of had a bit of a shift of heart that was really, really interesting in sort of the middle of my second year, where I kind of, because most of my excavations and most of my well, it wasn't even training excavations at this point, but halfway through my second year, I was on, I was leading some trench excavations and things, and I just kind of naturally happened to fall into Israel and sort of the modern kind of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, that kind of area. And I kind of just, it was a very interesting scenario where I kind of naturally, all the excavations that were currently going on that I could attend were in that area. So I ended up excavating for 2-3 years in Israel. And I was focusing predominantly on early Bronze Age stuff. So I was mostly excavating Bronze Age villages, or one in particular was around Tel and Jezreel. And I led a couple of trench excavations there, which was really, really fascinating. And I had always been fascinated by the cultic scene, and that entire discussion and all of that, all of my excavations there led me to do my thesis, which was originally on sort of early Bronze Age Southern Levantine cultic scene, or the cultic scene in the Southern Levant in the early Bronze Age. This is all kind of pre-Yahweh, it's pre kind of Israelite, pre the emergence of the Israelite ethnicity. And I was kind of looking at if there was a way, or if in any way we can establish that there is any kind of indigenous Levantine religion, because there is a common kind of belief or an attitude towards the Levant. And the Levant is kind of the area that in its widest geographical scope, it is kind of Eastern Cyprus to Mesopotamia and Iran and Iraq on sort of the left-hand side. Right? It's that area in the middle of the Fertile Crescent. It's kind of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, that kind of area. And I was looking at it and it was great. But when you look at how it's been treated in the past couple of decades of academia, it's really interesting because it's kind of in the middle. It's like prime real estate for Egypt in the south and sort of Mesopotamia in the north, right? And it's sort of sandwiched right in between these two huge, humongous empires who are constantly expanding their territory. And we kind of see evidence of it even in the Levant itself, right? A lot of the northern Levantine sites display Mesopotamian influence, whether it's architecturally or it's in religious iconography or whatever it is. And a lot of the southern Levantine ones, even from the pre-dynastic, we have some of the early Egyptian pharaohs, expanding out into the Levant and making things into the Sinai. So there's a lot of Egyptianizing influence. And as a result, the Levant is always kind of given very kind of a transient position.
And it always, even going into the medieval and the classical and even
right, exactly. And so this persistent kind of, attitude towards the Levant, like, it's not really somewhere where there's any kind of indigenous culture. It's just kind of like it's a colonist spot, basically. Like, all the influence comes from the native Egyptians in the south and the Mesopotamians in the north, or invaders who sort of came in and whatever. And there's like a recurring belief that all the kind of the local indigenous tribes there throughout all of history were kind of too barbarous or too savage to have any indigenous culture. Like that didn't sit right with me. So I was kind of studying it. I was like, well, even if we look at the early, like if you look at early Israelite cultic scene, then there must be some kind of indigenous local influence that's coming in, and turns out there was, as far as I can tell. And there are some very, very fascinating sites, things like Tel Hatzor, Tel Megiddo, Tel Jezreel that I was excavating at, and all these kind of places. They do display very kind of animistic tendencies, very kind of we have things called mastabot, which are kind of like standing limestone pillars, right? Basically, that are kind of, they're meant to probably represent ancestral figures or anything like that.
Now, just for my listeners, just so that they can place this is pre-Phoenician, pre-Canaanite.
Yes.
This is around 4,000 years ago,
about that. It's about like the early Bronze Age in the Levant is around sort of 3000 BC, 3100 BC, about 8200 BC, okay. That kind of area. So we're not necessarily looking at monumental architecture yet. There are buildings. We do have, most of them are mud brick, but there aren't huge monumental things yet. But when I was excavating on my site, or one of the sites at Jezreel, we were excavating what was effectively a Bronze Age village.
Wonderful.
And it was great. And there does seem to have been a cultic center in the village, right? There, as far as we can tell, there was a collapsed kind of mud brick structure that probably was some kind of makeshift temple. We're not entirely sure what it was. And it was fascinating because one of the biggest finds that we've actually found there was really, really interesting. It was a carved, a huge carved basalt stone. It's basically carved into the shape of a teardrop. And it's absolutely fascinating. This thing is huge. It's like I'm 6'4", right? I'm saying, this thing is like up to like maybe here on me when I like stand up, right? It's enormous. But this kind of thing was carved out of basalt because Jezreel is also sitting on top of basically like a volcano, right? It is a very core basalt source. And they clearly had some kind of, the basalt is clearly kind of attracting the people to the area in the early Bronze Age. And we also had these weird things at Tel Megiddo as well, which are kind of like little, there are probably like 6 of them theoretically, or we've discovered 2 of them, but there are probably 6 that are still buried in other areas. But they're basically like basalt tables, right? They're in the Great Temple at Megiddo, because at some point, Megiddo is a really fascinating site, not only because in biblical scholarship or in theology, it's supposed to be the site of Armageddon. It's actually where the word Armageddon comes from. And it's supposed to be the site of the final battle in the Bible, right? Where Satan and God's armies will kind of meet and kill each other effectively at the end. But during the early Bronze Age, weirdly, Megiddo is this huge cultural center. They have an enormous temple. It's like huge. It's like 50 hectares in the early Bronze Age, which is absolutely enormous. And this temple is monumental architecture. And in fact, one of the things that the excavators at Megiddo found is actually they're making use of the cubit measuring system about 100 or 300 years before the Egyptians, right? Oh. So it's a really advanced architecturally like system that's working there.
What is that suggestion then, that the Egyptian cubits evolved from the?
It's kind of like a tit for tat chicken and the egg situation. We're not really sure who did it first. people like it doesn't really matter as such. It's more kind of a discussion of, rather than saying, oh well, this person or this culture invented this or whatever it is, it's more kind of just showing that the cubit as a standardized measuring system was in use around this time period in general. We don't know who invented it. It's like the same thing with Pythagoras, right? Everyone's thinking Pythagoras invented his theorem, when we found out that the Babylonians did it about 600 years earlier, and then the Hindus also did it, you know, at some other point independently. So even though we call it Pythagorean theorem, the Babylonians kind of invented the whole thing with their trigonometry. So it's just kind of showing that the measuring system and the architecture is you know, they have a very established way of building monumental architecture using very clear measurement systems, which is amazing. But the Megiddo temple is fascinating because it is, again, 50 hectares, and it's in the early Bronze Age, you know, no other site compares to Megiddo. It's enormous. And what fascinated me is when you're looking at it, they have these really interesting, you know, you sort of look at the general overview of the whole temple, but in the center of the room, they basically have these, you know, 2 foot by 2 foot circular discs on the floor that are carved of pure basalt. And they are basically pure basalt tables, effectively. They're like little circular things dotted throughout regular intervals in the room. And we saw them and they were like, this is really weird. Like, this looks really interesting. Like, they're clearly cultic in some nature. Like, whether they were meant to be like deity stands for statues or whatever it is, we have no idea. But clearly what's going on in the early Bronze Age in this kind of region is they're obsessed with basalt for whatever reason. And there are tons of, you know, we can sit here all day and shoot the shit basically over why and how, whatever it is, but they seem to have had a very clear focus on basalt. And even before this, in the Chalcolithic, so the Copper Age, we have what's called the Gasulian culture in this kind of area. And Gasulian culture, we have places like Ein Gedi, where there was a hall called the Nahamishma hall that was discovered by, I think, Israel Finkelstein. And it's basically a massive collection of ritual objects. And most of them are made of copper. It's like copper crowns, copper wands, staffs, swords, all this kind of thing. And they were discovered sort of shoved in a cave, basically like a couple of miles from Gedi, and the working assumption is that the Nahamishma sword is associated with Ein Gedi for the most part, or it is the ritual implements of the Ein Gedi temple. That's kind of the working assumption. But one of the other things that we find at Gedi that's really interesting are, again, carved basalt statues, or carved basalt, like ibex bowls, for example, like bowls that have ibexes and things carved into it, but they're all made of basalt. So there was clearly a thriving basalt trade in the early Bronze Age in this kind of area, and they're using it for ritual equipment for whatever reason, right? And that entire thing absolutely fascinated me, and I was obsessed with it, and I kind of just eventually just, you know, it just melded very, very well with my interest in occultism, and I've always kind of been interested in occultism, and I kind of initially, honestly, quite funny, this is kind of funny saying it now even on camera, but one of my initial motivations for getting into archaeology originally was like, I kind of had the working assumption in my mind of like, oh well, I'm going to be on site, places that the public can't go, and I'm going to be able to go in these temples. You know, I'm going to be excavating the temple, I'm going to be excavating the tombs, and these are places that, you know, are of magical significance or occult significance. They're going to be being used by spirits in some capacity, and I have official permission to be there, whereby before the public. You know, I'm like, that was a big motivation for me, because I was like, I had already been getting trained before going into archaeology and occultism, right? And I was like, well, if I go into archaeology, then I can go to all these temples and like do my own practice and do my thing without interference from the general public. You know, that's kind of my whole motivation for it. And it worked a lot of the time. Like I was there on at ground zero when we were finding all this cool stuff. I was like, this is really fascinating. And like below in Israel, we were excavating a cultic center, and we were finding, you know, alongside kind of the big teardrop thing that we found, there were, you know, broken pottery around there. There's charred remains. There's like dog burials, all that kind of thing that were there. And I was like, yeah, this is exactly where I want to be. It's great. You know, it's amazing. But I was there and it was great. And that kept me occupied. That was most of my, you know, that was most of my dissertation, most of my thesis that I focused around. I had an amazing whale of a time. Uh, and then after I left, I got deeper and deeper into occultism, inevitably. And one thing led to another, and I ended up kind of shifting gears again and shifting focus more into late antiquity. And late antiquity is, again, the period from sort of after the classical age and to just before the medieval period, right? So it's around sort of like I can't remember what the exact, it's up to like the 6th century. It's like the 1st century to the 6th century, that kind of general, very loose time period. Where we have a huge amount of progression, and all the kind of the cultural layout is effectively set for the most of the Western religions and things like that. It's the time period where we have things like Hermetism and Gnosticism and Neoplatonism first coming into their own, right? And I just took a huge liking to that period, right? I became obsessed with it, and thankfully through my studies and through my academia account, I still have access to things like JSTOR and Project Muse and Sage and all the academic journals. I have access to it. So I have all this stuff as part of my alumni status. So I'm just going to use it to basically put myself through another year of university at home, effectively. And this was partly during COVID as well. But I'm here, I have access to all these journals. I may as well just become an expert in Hermetism and Gnosticism at this point. So I basically just spent an entire year reading academic journals on all this kind of stuff. And no, I wouldn't be arrogant enough to call myself an expert, actually, but I developed a very strong familiarity with the time period and in the historical context, from an academic point of view.
I was going to challenge you on that, but
yeah. Okay. So I'm not arrogant enough to do it yet. Maybe in a couple of years. You never know.
So that actually raises a question for me. Something that, you've given us a really good background of how you came up to this. Something I have been asking a lot of people, a lot of practitioners, most of the people on my cast so far, and the people coming up in fall, are sitting and straddling between academia and practice, right? And I think there's a general attitude in the magical community that academics are outside, specifically in the traditional witchcraft community. There's a big bias against academics, even academics who are actually in the magical and practitioner, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering for you then, consuming so much scholarship around Hermeticism and the mystical traditions of antiquity, and then trying to bring them into your practice now, because you do run a mystery school. We'll get to that in a moment. What is the dividing line for you? How do you discern between kind of that academic bias and also that academic pressure to remain outside, which I know is starting to really be challenged in academia, but what's the dividing line for you, and what has your experience been like that as a practitioner who is also an academic who is also a practitioner?
I think the easiest way for me to explain it, first and foremost, is that the understanding that there are kind of the two camps. There's the academic camp and there's the practitioner camp, and they're kind of not talking to each other. I tend to follow Christopher Warnock. I had Christopher Warnock, one of the most foremost Renaissance astrologers, on my podcast recently as well, and we had the same kind of discussion. And he put it very, very well. He goes, actually, there's a third option, and there is what he calls the rigorous practitioner. And that's basically a practitioner who has scholarly merit to them. So it's a practitioner who, even though they acknowledge the academic bias, but they approach their practice through the lens and with the, the tenacity of scholarship, right? Because the problem you have with, especially in the practitioner point of view, right? If we start with the practitioner, the problem people have with the practitioner stuff is the UPG, right? It's the unverified personal gnosis, in that we're kind of, especially when it comes to any practice where there is an anti-academic bias, people inherently, when they are getting into witchcraft, or they're getting into any kind of spirituality, what they're essentially looking for is a kind of trans-historical approach, right? They don't necessarily need their practice to be rooted in history. Right, my camera is going crazy. I don't know why it's
it's like we're
yeah, it's like we're going up and down. It's like nodding with my head. There you go. That's a bit better. But there is what people are often looking for when they get into stuff like this is a kind of a trans-historical basis, right? They're not necessarily looking for historical fact. They're looking for spiritual fact, or what they perceive as spiritual, mystical truth, right? Something that transcends the boundaries of time. Now, that can be really great, and it can give you some interesting visionary experiences and some your own gnosis, and that's amazing. But the line between what we can say is UPG and VPG, for me at least, is how well something fits into established tradition. Right. And we don't want to be too dogmatic with things. We don't want to be like, well, this isn't about this isn't traditional, therefore it's not real, or whatever it is. Right. Some people are like that. They're very on the elitist side of it, which is kind of not where I'm at. But I do think we need to understand the traditions, even if it's purely just because if you don't historically research the traditions, you don't know what you're saying yes to by being a part of that tradition, And what ends up happening then is you end up inheriting a lot of bias. You end up inheriting a lot of really shitty ideas, most of which, if you're basing, I don't know, for lack of a better term, people in sort of modern witchcraft community, a lot of time they're not super aware that the vast majority of their practice actually comes from the Victorians, not from anything historical in any kind of capacity, right? And they're wrong. There's nothing wrong with the Victorian stuff. I like the Victorian stuff in some capacity. They were wrong on a lot of accounts, but some of it, practically speaking, is very good, right? But the problem you have is if you don't do the research and you don't know the historical evolution or even the scholastic evolution of this stuff, then you end up inheriting all the biases of the Victorians. And the Victorians, if we look at them from our perspective today, they were pretty wildly racist, right? So there is a lot of colonial notions, there is a lot of culturally appropriated notions, there is a lot of, in general, just racial notions, right? Theosophy is a very good example, and I have been quite a vocal critic of that whole weird like New Age Lemuria starseed crowd group, whatever it is, because a lot of that goes back to very early theosophy and the root races, and it's the same ideology that gave birth to Nazism, which I'm very fervently against, obviously. But it's as far as my own practice goes with it, I always endeavor, like I tend to treat it quite simply, right? I will always distinguish, even if it's in my own academic work or it's in my own work, I will always distinguish between where my personal gnosis is and where what can be considered verified, right? So I take the approach of going, okay, I'm going to lay out the whole scholarship first. I'm going to do the research. I'm going to look at everything I can, and I'm going to have my academic integrity as a scholar, and I'm going to put that out there, do all that first, and then once all that's down on paper, it's all good, then I can take all of that, because to me, the scholarship and the history doesn't, people have this impression that it kind of like dries out the practice. It like scientizes the practice and it kind of like, pulls all the fun out of it. I disagree. I think knowing the historical context, the evolution of concepts, and going on that whole journey of tracing concepts and lineages back to their origin, I think enlivens the tradition for me. I find it exciting. I'm like, oh wow, like this is how there was an initial concept here that came in, and it evolved into this and got added into this kind of thing. It got retranslated through this. This is fascinating, right? And to me, it's a fascinating thing. I think it's amazing, and I know what I'm agreeing to when I practice that tradition. But I'll put all of my scholarship down, and then I'll take that because it informs my practice, and then I will go and have my UPG. I'll go and have my experience with the rituals. I'll go and do my thing, right? And honestly, that's kind of like they don't. I don't know. In a weird kind of way, and I may get some hate for this, but I get the feeling a lot of modern occultists are kind of entitled, right? There is an air of entitlement that comes through in some magical practice or some magical communities where people are like, well, my UPG has to be shared, right? This is my experience with entity. I'm like, great. I'm really happy for you. Like, that's your experience. That's amazing. Doesn't have to be anyone else's, right? Like, you don't have to shout it from the rooftop, be like, I've contacted the entity, it's great. Like, I get you're excited, it's fine, it's great, right? But it's like there is this general attitude that we often see in modern occultism, people being like, oh well, I had this experience with the Goetia is a prime example, right? I had this experience with a Goetic king, and it's because I think it's because of this, and it's like, great, like that appeared to you in the same way doesn't mean that's exactly how the Goetia is for everybody. Exactly. Not by any means. And the Goetia, I have also been a somewhat vocal critic of the Goetia, and I've almost twice because of that.
That is a whole
that's a whole other discussion we can get into. But as far as this goes, I use my scholarship in my academia, or I use the skills that I gained in academia to inform my practice. And to me, there is not a line between the two. And if you go back in history, you go back to any of the magicians from the medieval period, the Renaissance, whatever it is, there wasn't a distinction between academia and occult. Astrology was an established part of the university quadrivium, right? It was a established custom you would learn in university. And more than that, all of the historical Hermeticists from the Renaissance, all the Platonists, all these people who were practicing writing the grimoires, they were scholars first and foremost. They were translating Plato, they were in universities, they were doing all this kind of thing. So historically, this distinction between academia on one end and occultism on the other end, it doesn't exist historically. It's very much kind of a modern thing of people. It's a consequence of tribalism. Ultimately, people being like, oh well, I'm in this camp, I'm in the academic camp, and therefore I'm an outsider to these practices. It's like, I can understand it, and the problem you have, obviously, with the academic side of it is that the inherent bias for academia is atheistic materialism, right? They don't believe anything exists outside of an atheistic model. There are numerous ways you can disprove that, and we can go through that anyway. And it's also like it's a very weirdly modernist Western approach. Like it's a very like the whole atheistic materialism model is, well, even then actually. Walter Hanegraaff talks about this in one of his recent books on Hermeticism from last year, right? Hermetic Spirituality and Altered States of Knowledge in Late Antiquity. It's a phenomenal book. But when we take that assumption, even in academia, when we're translating magical text, and there is an inherent bias, someone like when you're translating the PGM, for example, Betts, who is the main translator of the PGM, he's terrible. Betts and Morton Smith, they are terrible for this. And don't get me wrong, I like Betts. I think he's done a decent job, a half decent job at least. Not to bash the guy, I like him. But his translation issues, they stem from the period of his time, right? He is influenced by his time period, and the problem you have is that he translates the PGM very academically. And the problem you have with that is he brings in a lot of the kind of atheistic material biases. Because it's magic and it's not real, it doesn't really matter if you translate it properly, because no, but it's just magic, right? It doesn't really care. The problem you have with that, especially from a practitioner's point of view, is he comes in and he's translating the Greek texts there, and most of the Greek texts have very clear head words about the name of the spell, the name of the ritual, the kind of the thing that's involved, whether it's a phylactery, a talisman, a charm, whatever it is. And he translates basically all of it as spell or charm. Right? He comes in, he's like, oh, like there's one instance, I think Stephen Skinner outlines this, but he's like, at one instance where, typically in PGM, an amulet, you can tell it's an amulet because amulets are made for other people. The magician themselves doesn't wear an amulet. The magician with the phylactery, they don't wear amulets. They're different procedures for creating and empowering them and invoking them, right? And Betts clearly translates something as a phylactery for earache in the PGM when it's clearly meant to be an amulet. And the Greek clearly says amulet, right? It's orania or whatever it is. And he just like pulls the term phylactery out of his ass for whatever reason and just translates it randomly. And the problem you have with that is the Greeks in the PGM have an entire vocabulary of magic. There are like 66 different types of magic in the PGM, and they're different procedures, different things. And Betts translates all of them as spell or charm, right? And that's a terrible, terrible thing if you're a practitioner, right? Because there are, talismans, amulets, phylacteries, they're all totally different things, completely different things. And they have entirely different procedures. They have entirely different words to use. It's a mess. Right now, thankfully, the PGM is being cleaned up in some recent translation. Brian Alt is doing an amazing book that's forthcoming. Was it Antique Magic? I can't remember. It's Christine. I can't remember, Christine or something. Orkinson. She's doing some really amazing stuff there. She's on YouTube. Antique Magic, and she's cool. She's doing really cool stuff. So it is starting to improve. But that problem of atheistic materialism kind of runs through a lot of the academic bias when it comes to scholarship. And a lot of the time, it's kind of the opposite in practitioner circles, right? Because there is that such staunch kind of materialist view in academia, the view of academia outside of it in the practitioner circle is kind of reactionary to it. They're like, well, we have to prove them wrong, right? Yeah. We have to prove that we are just as valid as the academics and doing this kind of thing. It's like, you don't really have to prove anything other than to yourself. But if a system works for you, it works,
But that's the thing, isn't it? That proving to yourself. I think something's coming to me. Julian Vane, when you had Julian Vane on your show, he said, and it seems to be a developmental thing. It seems to be a thing when people find something new, they're really excited about it. It's making change for them in their life. They go up the mountain, they come back down, and expect that everybody else is going to accept that,
Yeah.
or take on that personal gnosis because they've tied other people's what do you call them other people's ideas and connections to what they're saying, as being affirming of themselves, right? It's a personal thing. It suddenly becomes a personal thing. And so, it's like Julian was saying, you go up the mountain to find that power for yourself. That's wonderful. But that's not my power, right?
Yeah, it's not your story. Absolutely not.
But what I find interesting is, again, that problem with the intersection between the scholarship and the practitioner, how then that will impact people's personal gnosis. And I know this isn't just an issue with occultism. This isn't an issue with all forms of different forms of Reconstructionism has it. Even Wiccans have it when it comes to constructing their practice based on the scholarship, which is based on study that is really misunderstood, because that's the other piece too of scholarship, is that generally, because of how it's written, the jargon that's involved, the type of language,
Right.
the way that it's written is very specialized form of training. You need to do that.
Yeah, like reading academic text is like it's like reading another translation almost. It's like for most of the general public who aren't trained in the jargon of the field, right? It's like you're reading French or German. You may be reading another language, right? And one of my professors at UCL, David Wengrow, Dr. David Wengrow, he did a talk late last year at Chicago University, I think it was, the Oriental Institute in Chicago. And it was an amazing discussion where he basically made the entire argument that there should be no distinction between academic writing and accessible writing. So the public needs to have accessible writing, because the problem we have is that because the public doesn't have accessible writing, we have the rise of things like pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience. People like Graham Hancock, all the kind of the ancient alien theorists.
Bring him up.
I have mixed feelings about Graham Hancock. I was, as an archaeologist, being an archaeologist, I have worked in commercial archaeology and things. I have very mixed feelings about him. No wrong. I think he's a great writer. I'm not going to diss him. Like I will acknowledge the guy's skill. He's very good at writing. He's very good at presenting. He's very captivating, right? All of his theories are basically just Augustus Laplacion, which is like a very colonial archaeology in Mesoamerica. They are wildly racist. I don't think he's racist in of himself. I will say that. I don't agree with all the hate people coming in saying he's a white supremacist, he's racist, he's all this. Like, no, I think he's just kind of a bit of an idiot. He just doesn't know where his theories come from most of the time. I don't think he is himself. It's a whole thing. But the problem you have ultimately is when science or when academic sources in general have such a barrier around them and they're not accessible, it creates a vacuum in the world, right? It creates this vacuum in the general public, and the thing that fills that vacuum inevitably is digestible pseudoscience, right? And sometimes it's even pseudoscience that uses technical terms and jargon to sound fancy when it's really not, right? Archaeology is famous for this kind of stuff. It's really horrible. But I would even, and I spoke to Justin Sledge, so of Esoterica on another one of my podcasts, and he made a very good valid point with it, where it's like, there's an argument to be made that if you are an academic and you are not actively making your research available, or you are, purporting or participating in that kind of barriership of elitism with academia, there's an argument that you are failing in your scholastic obligation. Right. And it's quite a heavy accusation, but I kind of agree with them, to be honest. If you are not making your work available to people, right, then you have no right to kind of sit on the other side of the fence and say, you're an idiot for believing all this stuff. It's like, well, what are you doing to help them, right? The public has no other active sources, right? They can't afford it. You go to JSTOR, you go to Nature, you go to Project Muse, they're ridiculously expensive. If you're a regular member of the public, I get it for free because I was in academia. It's great. I'm very privileged, right? But it's like most of the mass public can't access that kind of stuff, So it's a real tragedy for people who are trying to get, they're trying to work with the practice, and some of them actually do want to. It's the thing. People like, I honestly, I kind of think accessibility of academia is the main driving force behind this division that we experience, right? This division between, oh, hey, practitioner over here, academic scholar over here. I think the main driving force between that division is people in both camps don't know how to talk to each other, right? Practitioners can't access academic work because they can't afford it, or it's just not accessible at all. And the academics, most of the time, especially in archaeology, I can speak for archaeology, we're all pretty weird and we're all kind of nerds in general. But none of us are amazing good presenters, right? And like it is changing a bit as the new generation's coming in. We're getting some good ones, but for the most part, we're not very good presenters. So we're not super captivating. Like when you think of lecturers or anything like that, some lecturers are very good, but in terms of public outreach, we're not super presentable, right? We're not super engaging when it comes to whatever it is, right? So that needs to change. And the consequence of it not changing is more constant pseudoscience, which inevitably erodes trust in academia on both parties, right? So it's a challenge. It really is.
So with that then, moving along to your work now in... I wanted to ask you about your coaching work. I think we don't have a lot of time for that. Maybe we'll bring you back for another conversation around that.
Yeah,
but you're around facilitating a community event. You founded Mystai, which is now a major project for you. I mean, it is one of your major line of works right now.
Yeah. It's kind of my main thing at the moment, or it's like the main the main thing where all of my work is kind of currently being put under the banner of, effectively.
And it's
so
one.
People...
Sorry, go on. Well, it is such a vibrant, wonderful community. You invited me into the Discord when I was on your show. I can see the level of people, and I'm not even watching your main thing, your forums on your website, but I know you've been putting a lot of effort into not only putting out the information, but also the experientials. I know you run I know you've spoken about it on other podcasts. Is it every Sunday you have your mass?
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting we're talking about this now. I had a meeting this morning with my team, and it's that sounds really fancy. That I sound very professional. I had a meeting with my team this morning. Yeah, no, but we are actually in a major transition period. So it's really great actually that I have an opportunity to talk about this, because this is kind of a world first, a big classic reveal of what we're going to be doing over the next sort of next couple of months. We're hoping even to have it launched by end of year, or by November, or also October, November. We were originally on like an official community platform, and we had sort of our own working social media site, basically like a private social media site. For the longest time, I have had a vision where I wanted to build an app. I wanted to get something out on the App Store and make magical practice accessible to people literally in their pocket, right? Like literally on their phones. Like that was my kind of vision, where my core working vision, and this also factors somewhat into my coaching and my business stuff anyway, but my core sort of life's vision at this point is, when I think of something like occultism, or I think of ritual, and I think of the amount of benefit that I've got from it, the transformative experiences, the visionary experiences, but also on a personal level, the deep connection to the land that I'm in, the connection to my ancestors, the connection to gods and spirits, right? That has been so radically transformative for me. And it's been so radically transformative for all the people I've taught. I got constant feedback saying, wow, like this ritual worked. I experienced something for the first time. I'm not afraid of demons anymore. All the kind of, those are amazing. That's amazing stuff for me. I love it. And I'm seeing the transformation. And one, I want to get it out to more people, but my working vision that has been driving me for a very, very long time is, I want to see occultism as a whole, or ritual as a general thing, as accessible and as unstigmatized as meditation or yoga is, right? People go to meditation and yoga classes every day, and now it's kind of the in thing. It's done, right? No one really bats an eye at you when you do meditation or you do yoga, and it's also accessible. And it's kind of it's framed now in the self-development and sort of holistic health world. It is framed as part of self-development, right? You can meditate, you can do practice, you can do yoga, you can do whatever it is, and it is incorporated as part of personal mastery, personal development. My vision is to see ritual also incorporated into that. I want to be able to see ritual. I would love to see a world, or I would love to see communities and people out there where you know, it's as acceptable for you to go, oh, hey, I'm going to my ritual class today, in the same way as it is say, oh, I'm going to my weekly yoga class. Right. You know, I want to see that vision come to reality, and that's what I'm trying to create in different communities that I'm doing, right? Where for me, I want to make it accessible to people. So yes, there is a big factor of the learning curve and the teaching and the material, all that kind of stuff. So making that accessible, but also making the ritual element of things, and it can be any kind of ritual, right? Whether it's an ancestral ritual or theurgic ritual that we're talking about with the Amicus, whatever it is, or the LBRP, any of the, you know, Golden Dawn, Victoria era rituals, they're all powerful, they're all amazing, and they will grant you incredible experiences, and you will have these incredible experiences where you're talking to spirits and you can interact, you can have these cool things, right? And I basically had this idea where I was like, I want to build this capacity, or I want to build this thing where we can kind of release the stigma around occultism, so that people could start using occultism and start using ritual as a means of self-development, as a means to better themselves. And, you know, if you want to get theological about it, a way to kind of reconnect us with the divine, you know, reconnect us to God in whatever capacity that is, by engaging these rituals, right? Which is incredible. And there is an argument I kind of wrestle with over, like, is it supposed to? I don't necessarily want it to be mainstream, because I don't know if it's supposed to be mainstream, but I want it in the very least to be accessible. You know, and one of the ways I did it is I kind of had this working idea of like, okay, what if we could build an app that not only let you track your meditation time, track your breath work, whatever it is, but also with push notifications and all that kind of thing, suggests like daily ritual to you, and then lets you track your ritual progress in an app, right? So say there's like an entire community. You've got all your usual community stuff. So you've got your private social media feed, like a private Facebook. You've got courses and everything built into there for the education. You've got the community events, all these kind of things where we're meeting and doing, you know, group rituals. We're doing group ceremony. We're doing all this kind of thing, and we're also meeting for lectures and that kind of thing. And I'll come back to the mass in a second, because that's another story. I was like, imagine if on your phone you could wake up in the morning, and as a daily prompt, for example, say there was like monthly thing, and I can kind of loop my coaching in as well with this, right? So say I'm coaching my community, and I'm saying, hey, this month we are focusing on, let's say, emotional intelligence, right? So we're going to coach you all on how to understand your emotions a bit better, how to communicate your emotions a bit better, all that kind of thing. So there's psychological therapy coaching in there as well, of helping people, you know, come to terms with their own stuff and their own emotions. But as a part of that, this app that we are building can theoretically send push notifications and suggest a daily meditation that helps you emotionally balance, a daily breath work that helps with emotional release, and then I can come in and be like, okay, what rituals or which entities and which spirits help with emotional regulation? Okay, well, it's going to be water elementals, it's going to be spirits of place, it's going to be all these kinds of things, right? Okay, here's a bunch of rituals suggested to you for you to do that can help you with emotional mastery and help you with emotional regulation, right? And then we can kind of cycle through themes and all that kind of thing. But that was my kind of working idea, where I was like, oh, it'd be really cool if we had an app that, as well as being a community, can also like actively take, you know, we build up an entire library of rituals, an entire library of text, all that kind of thing. And then we have an AI that basically combs through it all and picks out rituals that are going to be good for you based on preferences that you put in. And then it spits out a ritual for you and goes, hey, look, you're struggling with X, you're struggling with this and this and this. Doing this ritual or connecting with this God, we've matched this God or this spirit to you with our algorithm. Try working with it. Here's some ritual suggestions for you to do it, as well as everything else. And we're here to support you the entire way through with coaching and community and all this kind of thing. You know, that was my dream. That was my vision the entire time. And when we slowly started building to it, and we didn't have the app for a while. We built this kind of we built a community platform, and we were running daily events and all this kind of thing, and it was great. And we've been doing that for the past sort of 6 months, you know, and it's working really well. And one of the things that was so incredible and so beautiful that came out of it was we ended up, you know, me and a friend, especially, who was also a practicing hermeticist, we ended up building a hermetic mass of sorts. And this was it was quite a weird and funny adventure, mostly because I remember being on another podcast, on the Shove It Up Your Island podcast with your friend Clinty, right? And everyone, like, I got some very funny comments on that. It was absolutely beautiful. When they asked me what my favorite ritual was, I said, "You're going to hate me for this, but it's mass." and everyone was like, oh, "You're an occultist, and your favorite ritual is mass, like sacrilege." I was like, "Okay, hold on, like let's back up a bit here." Basically, like to cut a long story short, what ended up happening with this, me and my friend, we are both hardcore into Hermetism, right? Historical Hermeticism, which is the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus and the kind of the philosophical tradition that emerged in early late antiquity. It's around sort of the 1st to 5th century AD. It is, for me at least, it is my religion at this point. I have no problem anymore. I went through a phase where I was very like anti-label of thinking like, I'm not going to put a label on it. I'm going to put myself in a box, all this kind of thing. Now I'm very much no, I want to belong to a tradition. I want to feel at home somewhere, and Hermetism is my home turf, right? It's what I feel most connected to. And the beautiful thing about it is that it was never forced on me. It was never a religion that, and it is a religion ultimately. Hermetism is a religious practice. It's not just a philosophical one. The way of Hermes is a religious tradition, and it was one that I discovered. Like through academia, through my studies, through my scholarship, I started reading these texts and these philosophical texts that are attributed to Hermes, and I found so much beauty and the worldview and so much value in them. That I was like, I fully just converted. I was like, you know what? I'm happy identifying as a Hermetist at this point. Like, it feels very resonant with my belief system. I believe it. I'm here for it. And it really came out of a desire that I wanted to be doing more Hermetic ritual. So I wanted to be doing more ritual that was instinctively Hermetic or distinctly Hermetic. So one of the things that me and a friend did, and my friend is also a very hardcore Hermeticist or Hermetist, is we both kind of looked at the general structure of a Christian mass or like a traditional Catholic Latin mass. And the reason we chose the Latin mass is, and again, people always give me hate for this, but it's true, unfortunately, for occultists. If you're working any of the traditional grimoires, attending a Latin mass will give you so much context for how the grimoire ritual works, right? That it's insane, because most of the early grimoires in the medieval period are written by church clergy. And in fact, there is numerous evidence to show that the early conjurations and the incantations, the things that are actually spoken to get the spirit there in these grimoires, they are exorcisms. They are derived almost entirely from Dominican exorcism. They're just said in reverse, right? A conjuration to call a spirit is basically like a reverse exorcism. That's all it is. You're saying an exorcism backwards, basically, right? You're taking the deprecative formula of an exorcism and you're just inverting it to basically call the spirit back. That's all you're doing, right? So while, yes, people like Jake Stratton-Kent's have done amazing work to show sort of the pre-Christian origin or Greek origins of Goetia and all that kind of thing, and that's another conversation. The historical context for the Goetic tradition and the grimoire tradition is ultimately a Catholic worldview. It's ultimately Catholicism. It's priestly service, right? And attending a Latin mass will give you so much context for how a grimoire ritual is supposed to look, right? Because there really wasn't a distinction. Some of the early, most of the early purifications in the consecration stages of the ritual are the same consecrations you undergo at mass, right? Because they're church clergy members, they're writing stuff, right? So me and my friend were kind of looking at the grimoire tradition, and we were like, okay, let's strip this back and let's say, okay, let's look at a Latin mass, but let's try something a little different, and let's take the kind of the general overtly Christian themes out of it, or merged Christian themes with stuff from the Corpus Hermeticum and stuff from the Asclepius and the Stobaean Hermetica as well, which is the other sort of Hermetic thing, or Hermetic fragments. And what effectively came out of it in the end was basically a Hermetic Eucharist, effectively. So we took a Latin mass with complete with the Eucharist and the purifications and everything, and we inserted kind of Hermetic traits into it, and invocations to the planetary archangels, discussions and readings and sermons from the Corpus Hermeticum, and distinctly kind of Hermetic prayers, because this is one of the things that one of my forthcoming books is about. It's practical Hermetica, effectively, where it's few and far between, but in the Corpus Hermeticum especially, there are some in Corpus Hermeticum 1, Corpus Hermeticum, I think 10 and 13 as well, have some ritual elements in there. And there are some discussions in the Stobaean Hermetica. And of course, in the PGM, which is the Greek magical papyri, there are other distinctly Hermetic rituals, right? Or rituals that are prayers to Hermes and all this kind of thing that Hermeticists in the ancient world would have been practicing, right? And we basically took all of that together, any kind of semblance of like historical Hermetic ritual that we could find, and put it into a mass context. So we basically just sort of took and invoked all those things together. And we basically put it out to the community and like our little private community as a test run to basically say, look, we built this entire like purification Eucharist ritual structure. We want to try it out. Who wants in? And then we ended up having it just one thing led to another. It ended up becoming a weekly thing. Everybody just went crazy for it and they loved it. And everyone was like, oh my God, this is the most purifying, most beautiful ritual I've ever felt. I feel incredible. I feel so connected to God. You know, we were going through the whole thing, and it's just become a staple of our community. We do it every week on a Friday evening now. So we do it on Shabbat, basically.
Wonderful. Okay, that actually ties into my next question, because going back to our discussion around that real distinction between, the two camps and then the third camp, right? The idea of bridging and coming back again. So I'm curious. I was curious about how then you, standing in multiple different worlds and realms in this sphere, how do you, with this corpus of information that you've personally gathered for yourself, all this research that you've done, in wanting to then bring it out of the shadows and make it accessible, how do you facilitate that in knowing that your personal practice is built upon so many hours of research, so many hours of having this really specialized knowledge? How then do you bring it out? It sounds like, with what you just said, one major way forward was to create the experience and then have people experience it. But is that all? I mean, do you still believe that in facilitating this for everybody, there needs to be that background knowledge in order to understand fully? Or is it just an experience project, or somewhere in between?
So I have two answers to this. It's quite funny. So initially, my first sort of venture into public teaching and sort of being like a lecturer, effectively, on this topic, I was originally a part of another company or another studio. I won't say the name because they're a bit shaky with things.
Of course.
But I was originally a part of their community, right, or their thing, and I sort of put out my first initial course with this community. One thing inevitably led to another. We ended up parting ways. We had creative differences, which is what everyone always says, right? You can tell where I'm going with this, but we had differences, quote unquote. And I ended up taking that course, that first course that I made, and then that became the first course I put on Mystai initially. And I had originally planned to teach about 12 modules in the entire thing. So it was supposed to be a year-long course. And I finished maybe module 1 before I kind of parted ways with this company. And one thing led to another, where like I was basically just meant to be like, it was a course that was meant to be kind of an introduction to magic, right? Like introduction to magical practice, how to do ritual, interacting with spirits, all that kind of usual stuff.
Yes.
And then as I started going through it, I realized that it just wasn't enough. And everyone was kind of like, oh, I want to stay with you and keep doing this. This is really interesting. The stuff you're teaching is really fascinating. So one thing led to another, and I basically just ended up expanding into a 2-year course and then a 3-year course. And then it just kept growing and growing and growing and growing. I was like, oh. And then at this point now, I'm like 2.5 years in, and I'm like, oh yeah, this was supposed to be like a 6-month thing, like a year-long thing. Now I'm like 2.5 years in, I'm still teaching live like twice a week. I'm lecturing twice a week. I'm like, huh, yeah, this is kind of typical of me. It's like I start doing something that's supposed to be like relatively small scale, and then it just inevitably grows into this huge, enormous thing. It's like now I'm still doing it. I'm still teaching twice a week, and that's kind of the main active live course I'm doing on Mystai at the moment. But that's one way of doing it, where I sort of put out a course initially, and then that course, what was supposed to be like, a relatively short course, has ended up becoming like a 2-3 year, effectively like boot camp training program that takes everybody. I basically just started at the very beginning. I basically went back and like, right, let's go back to prehistory, go back to the Paleolithic, look at totemism, animism, look at shamanism, look at all these religious practices, look at how we define magic in here, and then let's just go all the way through. And I've covered everything there. So like, if I'm thinking of it now, slight shameless self-plug. Module 1 is basically the history of magic, right? History of occultism, which I basically just do a sort of a rapid fire, and that was like 6 months we were on that for whatever it was. It was like a really long module, which is basically just key figures in magical history from prehistory to Plato to Iamblichus to Hermetism, all of it, all the way up to modern chaos magic and Wicca, basically, and like modern, postmodern, modern stuff. Then we got into module 2, which was like, you know, fundamentals of craft, basics of candle magic, basics of invoking spirits, all that kind of thing. Then module 3 and 4 ended up being in energy work and like self-healing, Reiki practices, any of that kind of stuff, which was very interesting. I kind of went into like Tantra and Vajrayana Buddhism and all that kind of thing, which was fascinating for me. And like empowering the subtle body. There was it. Module 5 was more kind of traditional witchcraft. So it was like the like lamps of art and all that kind of thing. Very interesting stuff. Modules like 6, I think module 6 was all entities. So it was all looking at the different kinds of. It was basically like a Fantastic Beasts movie. You know, I basically just went through like all the categorizations of spirits, like, hey, daimons, angels, elementals, different kinds of fairies from different British folklore, how to attract them, how to work with them, like different offerings you can give to different ones, all that kind of thing. Then like 7, 8, 9, whatever it was, it's all on Solomonic stuff. It's all hardcore ceremonial magic, how to do it, what it is, all that kind of thing, which is insane. It's all the Grimoire procedure. And then was it module 10, which we're on right now, is like more very advanced energy work. And then 11, which is next month or the month after, is going to be on thought forms and egregores, so how to create that. And then module 12, which is the final one, is going to be on astral projection and leaving the body, all that kind of thing, ascent. And that initially was supposed to be like 6 months, right?
That's a lot.
I was seeing that. I was like, yeah, I'm going to get all this done in 6 months. It's going to be great. And then it just started happening. I was like, then it took me 6 months to do one module. I was like, oh shit, this isn't gonna work. You know,
I was the 22-year-old you being like, yeah, this is just
right. It was 22-year-old me being like, I have all this knowledge. Yeah, I'm just gonna put all this out there in 6 months. It's gonna be great. You know, lovely. And then it didn't happen. So then I ended up creating. It ended up turning from a single course into like a 3-year boot camp training for all magic. Right? Like I went into with the perspective of being like, if like. My students were in there. If they never have to buy another course or another book on magic, I've succeeded. You know, like that was kind of the arrogant perspective that I went in as a young 22-year-old as. Now I've kind of come into it. I'm like, okay, well, there are so many other practices I don't know. If like when I come into it, if all I do is provide you with a solid foundation for how to approach other magical texts, then I've succeeded in my job. You know, like that's what I want to do. I want to give you guys enough of a good foundation in magical philosophy and a magical worldview and like the mechanics of ritual, like what to actually do, that you can approach any kind of magical system and have it more or less work for you, you know, like work on the same principles. And that's worked for the most part. So that was the first way. The second way of, I guess, going by the experience and teaching people is ultimately experiential. So it has to be experiential, right? You can't, there is a part of me even now, and like I am, you know, another major plan, like when the community gets to that point in general, I do want to start doing in-person retreats. You know, I do want to start doing in-person events where like conferences or whatever, where people can come and we can teach and we can do ritual in person together, you know, and we can like teach a class on ritual in person with all the implements and the tools there. You know, that's something that's another dream of mine to do, like create an actual retreat center that does this stuff. But because it has to be experiential, right? Like I always maintain this, even in my own books, in my own research, in my own courses, whatever it is. I can teach you what to do and how to do it, but I can't have the experience for you. It's like, and this is something I talk about in my forthcoming book as well on Hermetic stuff, right? It's like there is a certain mystery, a certain gnosis that comes purely from praxis.
Absolutely.
You know, you can't, like, you can read about it, absolutely, and that's great. You can have an experience, like you can have a theoretical understanding of it, but until the time where you actually get an altar set up and you actually sit there and you actually do something and you feel your skin change, you feel the hairs in the back of your neck move, whatever it is, something shifts in you. Like there is a doorway to the unseen that opens in that time window or that time period where you're in there, and that is the time when true transformation happens for you. You know, it's like I can be your guide and your facilitator. I can be like, hey, here's some good rituals, here's some good resources for you to do this, but if you don't do it, like I can't do anything for you. You know, so when we were doing the Hermetic Mass as an example, it's like we were leading the mass. Like, it was me and my friend, and we had the theoretical knowledge, we had the background knowledge, right? So we know all the stuff there. But you don't have to know all the like the theological Hermetic stuff to get benefit out of the mass. You do if you're leading it, you know, because you have to understand the theology, you have to understand the sermons, absolutely. But at the same time, not everyone wants to lead it. But for the people that do, we have the school set up so they can go through it and they can train to become kind of a Hermetic sermon reader, you know, so they can train to lead the mass, right? And there is another kind of a mystery that comes with that as well, you know, so leading a congregation. And you know this as well when it comes to things like spiritism and all that kind of thing. When you're commanding a crowd and the energy of a crowd and commanding a congregation, there is a certain energy that comes with that that's very unique to the experience, right? And there's a mystery in there as well. So you don't have to know all the stuff to get benefit out of the mass or get benefit out of the rituals. All you have to do is kind of sit there and follow along, right? Because it is kind of call and response, the general kind of style, right? So you do kind of engage it. And it's fascinating. People have been getting like great benefit out of it so far, which is amazing to see. It's like, and I just want to share this stuff because like when I've gone through it and I've had incredible experiences with it, this stuff has been radically transformative and improved my health hugely. It's improved my mental health. It's, you know, it's made me more reverent. It's made me more connected. I'm like, I just want to share that with people. It's an incredible experience, you know. So I'm doing that. I like to say I'm curating spaces for the experiences to happen. Even if I'm not directly involved, I'm creating containers for people to meet each other and practice together. And then they have the experience themselves. And then they come back in the community, they talk about it. But hey, like I did this ritual that you suggested with this other friend of mine here. We had this incredible experiences. And then we can feature them in the community feed. You know, it's amazing. It creates this beautiful kind of cycle of stuff, you know.
It's a lot of responsibility, though, on your part, because just thinking of the ethics side of that, right? You know, like the reason that spiritual traditions evolve in the way that they do cross-culturally, it doesn't matter what culture you look at, there are always religious specialists who are the whole containers of the safe use of those mysteries. And then the kind of the outer court, the culture, the community who engage with the ritual, but that is commanded by those who are specialized and being do it safely, right? There's a lot of weight in then developing that community so that people aren't just going off and doing ritual without necessarily the safety measures built into that ritual, so that they're not going insane, right?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. It's like that's why the community practice exists, right? Like that's why we have the community set up in the way that it is, where it's like, obviously we can't, you know, we can't stop people doing any kind of ritual. You know, people can do whatever ritual they want to do, and that is ultimately up to them. But thankfully, with all the training and things we have in place, by the time you do start practicing ritual, you have enough of the basic like psychological foundation to not go insane, or you have enough of the basic common sense to be like, okay, I know what to do and all this kind of thing. And like, I'm not going to do these kind of ritual. I'm not going to work with these entities in any kind of way. Like I generally take the approach of like, no knowledge should be forbidden. Only in the confines of a community, only certain practices are they're not frowned upon, but like only certain practices are like, we don't really do that here. You know, we can know about it, we can learn about it, but it's like we don't advocate for, you know, hardcore like theistic necromancy or whatever, where people are going and robbing graves or anything like that. Which is actually a thing here, believe it or not. Like it's not so much around here, but like in England, like they have passed laws around grave robbing and stuff, mostly because there are people who go out and do this weird shit, you know. Well, it is a lot of responsibility. It really is, you know. And it's like, thankfully, and again, this is it's set up in a very lovely way, or like the way it's kind of synchronistically come along is very, very good, because both myself and one of the other people on my team, who is basically like a co-founder, we both have quite a lot of experience in prior cults and cultic ideologies and that kind of thing. So we know the signs to look for, you know. We look at we know the general, you know, behaviors of when people start idolizing us as well. And this is another huge thing of in the other company that we were in originally, that started to happen with our boss, effectively, right? Like it started to, people started to view him as kind of like a cult leader, you know, and he kind of lent into it a little bit. And there are other spiritual influencers who do the same kind of thing, and they're aware of what they're doing all the time. I'm not going to name names, obviously, but thankfully, like the way we all kind of met each other, and the way we all kind of came together, we came together with a very clear goal of being like, no, this is a place for people to learn and go off on their own, right? To go and do these different things, you know. So we are all very aware of when things start to border on cultish behavior. And thankfully as well, we are all trained coaches and counselors as well that came together, right? It's like obviously I'm not trained in therapy or anything like that. I didn't qualify as a psychotherapist, but I did train as a coach. Yes. In general, right, which is some of the basic, like the idea of holding space and how to draw things out of people. I generally kind of take the approach of being like, therapy is more about kind of going into the individual and asking why and discovering these things. Coaching is more about bringing stuff out of the individual. You know, it's bringing things up because it's that kind of general perspective on things, right? And thankfully speaking, almost everyone on my team, or everyone in the kind of the things who are facilitating ceremonies or are facilitating things in general, they are all either trained counselors or trained coaches. And they're all certified as well, like in some manner of speaking, you know, which helps. Like in general, I think it helps to know how to facilitate and how to hold space for people, because
and that's the most important.
You know, it's an issue.
Well, that's the most important thing, bit about that. I've talked with quite a few of my other guests around, especially those who are coming from a psychotherapeutic lens when it comes to spirituality, is that there's another danger with that, which is people can entirely just psychotherapize the experience. It's not a lived experience. It's all suddenly very intellectual.
It's all very psychological. Like Crowley did that as well, which is huge. It's very interesting. It's one of the areas that I frequently disagree with Crowley on. I think one of his worst hot takes was him saying that, the Goetia, all the 72 egretic spirits they correspond to 72 parts of the brain.
Right.
You know, and I was like, you know, like I mean, if he had said the mind, like you could maybe get away with that half and half, you know, but the brain, no. I draw the line there, you know. But I mean, you can understand it. It's the same thing as like what modern new agey people do with quantum physics, right? It's the new kind of insight that confirms consciousness and spirituality, right? It was the same thing that was happening 100 years ago at Crowley's time, when psychology was a brand new discipline, right? It was a new thing. It was the new science on the block. Everyone loved it. Crowley was like, this is the science that's going to legitimize magic. So he tried to psychologize all of magic. You know, it's like, you're right. And you're absolutely right. When you begin to psychologize like that, it takes away from it being a lived experience, you know, or even like if you, I don't know, it's one of those things, and it's a very hard thing to understand when you're in sober consciousness. Yes. Right. I don't just mean sober in the sense of like not drinking. I mean like everyday waking consciousness. Right. Yes. And this is also, it's the same problem we have coming back again full circle to the academia. Right. There is an inherent bias when it comes to scholarship and academia, in that if we are inherently relying on what we call a monophasic model of consciousness, right, which is only kind of waking beta consciousness, waking alpha consciousness is the only reliable source of knowledge, right? We are taking it as a given, or taking it for granted that only sober waking consciousness can be relied on for gaining true knowledge, right? This idea that only the kind of consciousness or the state of mind in which you perform scholarly work is the only way that you can acquire any semblance of truth. Right. Anything else is juxtaposed to that, or sort of it's put in this weird hierarchy of being, right, where it's like sober rational consciousness is at the top, which is like the big I am, the big kind of, you know, it's the only way you can acquire truth, and then everything else is put underneath it in this weird hierarchy, and it's kind of, you know, sobriety and that kind of monophasic model of consciousness is put in opposition to kind of states of ecstasy and transcendence. Right. And they're completely opposite. And anything you gain from, you know, altered states of consciousness that aren't waking consciousness or aren't the norm, right, which itself is heteronormative, they're somehow not valid because they're not in your everyday waking consciousness. The problem you have is you're then taking it as a given and for granted that your waking consciousness is correct. that it is the norm, right? And historically, that isn't the case. If you try to say that to a Hermeticist or a Neoplatonist in late antiquity, they would look at you very, very funny, right?
Yes.
They would argue that the kind of knowledge you get from waking consciousness, because it is inherently a limited faculty, right? Our state of knowledge and how we perceive knowledge is ultimately a faculty or a function of our state of mind, right? Our relation to knowledge depends on what state of mind we're in. Now, if you go back to largely any indigenous culture, they rely on polyphasic models of consciousness, right? They rely on they have and accept different phases of consciousness and different phases of reality. Ultimately, the basic assumption here is that there are degrees of reality, right?
Absolutely.
We are assuming, or academics and sort of mainstream kind of the atheistic model assumes that only the degree of reality that you can perceive and empirically prove, quote unquote, is the true reality, right? Take one read of Plato's Republic, it disproves all of that.
Oh, completely. Absolutely.
Right. Plato is very fervently opposed to that kind of very material bias, right? And it's interesting, I often talk about this. Plato has no word for matter, that matter does not exist as a metaphysical constraint for Plato. The closest word would be soma, which is body. Right. And in fact, Plato is the first to make a systematic distinction between soma and asomata, which is immaterial. So he is the first in sort of Western civilization, as it goes, to make a distinction between material and immaterial things, right? Or physical and non-physical things. He's the first to do it, right? And the reason for it is he has his whole hierarchy of the forms and images and all that kind of thing. And it's a fascinating discussion. But the ultimate point here is, if we take it for granted that only our waking consciousness can be relied on for gaining a true measure of reality, then we are inherently limiting ourselves to only the things that you perceive in waking consciousness, right? And that is a huge oversimplification and a huge bias that gets in the way of any other kind of gnosis, any other kind of experience that you have, right? And it's also very arrogant and very egocentric, if you ask me, because you're kind of sitting there being like, well, my version of reality and my version of the truth and my way of accessing the truth is the only right one. And everyone else who doesn't get truth the way I get truth is wrong, and they're in delusion or they're in altered states, and it's therefore not valid. Well, and we're basically discounting everybody else. It's very egotistical.
Well, I would hope that by now our modern Western society is catching up to the idea that
things are changing. Yeah,
are changing. That even perception is a subjective thing. But it goes back to even the paradox of Menno, right? The idea of how can you explain how somebody can be so certain that they know something, even though they may not have learned it in this life, right? I love that whole discussion around that piece, because again, even from a rationalistic standpoint, you can argue logically that there must be other alternative states of consciousness, other alternative states of being.
Absolutely, yeah,
directly here, right? But but that's a very Western bias too. Again, you go into other different parts of the world, and that isn't even a question. That there are alternative realities, alternative sections of reality and whatnot, and but
it's the degree, or it's the degrees of reality ultimately, right? It's that kind of hierarchical position. And again, if you look at if we use the ancient Greek model again, Plato's model, they very clearly view the universe as a vertical model, right? It is very clear. If you ask Plato where the heavens are, he will point upwards. It's very much kind of a vertical model of existence that is in different degrees of reality. I quite like the term inner self, honestly. Like there is a whole other discussion here around the nature of the soul, right? And what's really interesting is, again, if you read something like the Timaeus of Plato, he doesn't actually draw too much of a distinction between the mind and the soul. In fact, actually, the mind effectively is just the processing faculty of the soul, and is that sense of awareness, the suke, right? It is that sense of ultimate that seat of conscious awareness is the suke, which is the soul, right? And that's where the modern word psychology comes from, right? Suke, psyche. It literally means soul in Greek. So it's an interesting kind of debate, and I tend to prefer kind of the bounded inner self as the term, rather than particularly soul, because soul has inherent, associations. If you say soul, somebody inherently kind of thinks it's a religious thing. But it's really not, because if you think about it, what we're effectively referencing when we say soul is the bounded conscious awareness, right? It's the individual perception of the I am consciousness, right? That's basically all it is. So that, even if you take the theology and the religious part of it, that's basically the mind, right? In modern sort of Western systems, the mind has become the soul, or the soul's become the mind, basically, and what's really fascinating about it is, again, Plato doesn't make a distinction. When he talks about the mind and the soul and consciousness, he talks about nous and psyche as conjoined things, right? So the mind and the bounded sort of inner awareness there is itself, is the soul, right?
Yes.
That's what it is, And there is a whole other discussion. I was listening to Dr. Richard Seaford at Exeter recently. He was talking in a lecture about sort of the differences between psyche and awareness as it appears in Homer and as it appears in Plato. And it's this whole thing with the axial age and all that kind of thing. But he basically makes this really, really interesting argument that the idea of an individualized personal soul or a personal bounded awareness doesn't actually come into Western discourse, or it doesn't even come into public discourse as a human thing until the advent of property ownership. And this is a very anthropological discussion as well, where if you go to, if you look at anthropological discussion, especially from the 1960s and onwards and that kind of thing, where if you look at any of the ethnography, especially in places like Polynesia or Melanesia, right, it's very clear these cultures, they don't often have a word, or they don't often have a concept of the individual soul. They don't have, because they don't have this concept of a bounded inner self or an inner organ of consciousness, right? Until the arrival of the trade cart in those areas, until the arrival of Western economic and political models that inherently implies personal ownership. They don't have this option of the soul. So inevitably, so there are kind of two options with this, right? You can either go, well, all of these cultures have lived their entire life rather stupidly and just not realized that they have a soul, they have an individual soul, or you can take the much more logical assumption and say actually that the inner self and the inner personal soul is a construction, that it is a westernized, or I wouldn't even say it's a Western construction, it's a general human construction that accompanies the arrival of personal ownership property in a culture. And we see the same thing in the transition from Homer to Plato.
Interesting.
Right? Because when you look at the Iliad and Odyssey, the economic model is shared ownership. There is no money in the Iliad and Odyssey. It's all barter economy, right? And because it's focused largely and intentionally on high-class elites, for the most part, the way that elite kind of giving is established, or elite relationships are established, is the giving of gifts, right? So people will give gifts to the not the suitors, but like when you arrive, you have the whole thing of Kenea or Xenia, right, which is good hostmanship, and you bring gifts and that kind of thing. That's how you kind of trade ownership. And arguably, and Richard Seaford argues this absolutely incredibly, it's really interesting, where the entire Iliad arguably can be broken down into a crisis of gift exchange, and politically and economically it is a story about the transition from a gift-based economy to a monetary personal ownership-based economy. Because the way it's so fascinating, because the way he explains it, like one of the most important lines of the Iliad is when Agamemnon is coming along and they sack a bunch of cities before Troy, and he's supposed to give out the gifts and share the plunder properly, but he does it improperly. He takes a lot of it for himself, and he kind of botches the whole thing. And what ends up happening is Achilles says one of the most important lines in the Iliad when Agamemnon tries to get him back into battle, because obviously Achilles runs away, or doesn't run away, he kind of sulks a bit and goes, well, I'm not fighting because you messed up my priestess, you messed up with all the gifts, all this kind of thing, right? And Agamemnon's answer to that is to try and give him more gifts, right? He tries to give him more stuff, and Achilles says the very famous line in Greek, I can't remember what it is in Greek, but he goes, your gifts are hateful to me. Right, and that in itself is one of the most important lines of the Iliad, because it shows the transition and the falling away of the gift economy into more kind of monetary personal ownership. And what's really interesting is Psyche does appear in Homer, right? So this idea of the soul does appear in Homer, but it's not in the sort of the sense that Plato sees it. It's not the bounded organ of consciousness per se. It is because the soul of Patroclus does appear in Hades, that kind of thing. But it's like he's there, but he's not there. His awareness is there, but his personality isn't really there. It's Patroclus, and he's there. He's Patroclus for all eternity, but he's kind of like this weird, immaterial, ghostly form of him. So you can kind of put your hand through him, and then he'll disappear ultimately. But the whole sort of long-winded way of saying it, and again, this also happens in the Rig Veda as well, as he talks about. So if you go over to Indian poetry, the very famous phrase in things like the Upanishads, because the Upanishads mirror the same thing, or the transition from the Rig Veda to the Upanishads mirror this same idea of, originally there is kind of this idea of the no self, right? There is this idea that actually the inner self, the personal soul, the my soul there is a construction, because they don't talk about it. They just talk about a boundless energy of conscious awareness that we are constantly experiencing, right? It's only in the Upanishads there that we get the very famous phrase, Atman is Brahman, right? So your personal soul is Brahman, it is everything, right? And it's only with the transition and the arrival of kind of personal property that the idea of personal soul even enters public discourse and enters the conversation. Prior to that, there is no real discussion in any of these texts over a personalized soul. If you look at any of like the pre-Socratics, for example, Heraclitus is a really good example. He doesn't make this distinction of an immaterial soul. He argues there is a soul, but the way he describes it as is with a kind of like a quasi-material fire. So the soul is actually like a material object. It's a material thing to Heraclitus, rather than like an immaterial kind of thing, that's kind of existing there. It's a weird, interesting kind of fun debate when the mind has kind of become the new soul. It's the bounded organ of consciousness ultimately, right? So all of this kind of like it's one of those interesting things where the discussion of like modern neuroscience trying to prove consciousness is effectively proving the soul, right? That we're just the lack of acceptance that this is the soul, or the mind is the soul, is largely a reactionary movement that has its roots in the Enlightenment, because in the Enlightenment, modern science tried to sort of define itself as the height of reason, and placed religion and ecstasy on like a hierarchical scale below it, and said, okay, well, we're distancing ourselves from superstition, and the soul is part of superstition, therefore we've moved beyond that. In reality, you haven't moved anywhere. You just changed the label, right? You're calling it something else. You're proving the same thing ultimately, So it's a fascinating discussion, and I don't know enough about, but like Richard Seaford has written loads of books on this about like the economy of the Iliad and all that kind of thing. So check out his stuff, listeners, if you want to learn more kind of thing. It's incredible, but
absolutely. Unfortunately, we have come to time. We're a little over time. So before we go, then, how can people reach you? How can people reach out to you? I will put these links down below, but what's the best way you can reach out?
Well, so the website at the moment is mystai.co.uk, so www.mystai.co.uk. I am pretty active on Instagram at the moment, or I'm trying to be more active on Instagram, which is Mystai Official. And they're kind of my two main places at the moment. We have an email list that's going out that is kind of general. It's like astrology updates, energetic updates, and just general company updates for that kind of thing. In the next month or so, we will be releasing the app, or the next couple of months, whenever it's ready, when we start building it, we will be releasing the app, and we'll put it out through all those channels in usual. But we are, so I kind of partnered with another organization, or we're making like part of the academy area in Mystai is called Golden Shadow, which is it's taken from Jung's stuff, where the Golden Shadow is kind of the idea of the repressed potential, right? So if you look at the shadow consciousness, when we push away the shadow, we repress parts of the shadow, we also repress all the good qualities that come with those qualities, right? And the golden shadow, or golden shadow work, is about going into the shadow and reclaiming those qualities and bringing them back to the surface in a healthy way. And that's kind of the name for our coming academy. That will probably be the name for the app and stuff as well. But you can find all the info on that on the Instagram, on the website. And I of course, like you said, I run my own podcast at Into the Couldron, which is great, and that's on my YouTube channel, which again is Mystai as well. So I'm also trying to get more active and put some stuff out on there as well. So
Go and check those things out. Go and check out the YouTube channel of the podcast. Go and check out the website and Instagram. I'll put those links down below. And I just want to thank you for coming on and having a vibrant conversation about some of these things, especially for perhaps viewers who may not be as aware. I know you're more well known in the UK than you are in North America.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, right. So I was really pleased to have you on, and I hope that by the time this chat goes out, you'll actually be on a plane. So I hope that you've had a plane flight, and I hope that you have a wonderful time in Greece.
Thank you. Yeah, it's gonna be great. I'm hoping to record some good content there as well. So I'm gonna take in my tripod, see if I can record in the palace and all that kind of thing. It'll be very fun.
That would be fantastic. That would be just beautiful. Wow. Well, I certainly look forward to that. I really do look forward to that. Now, I should probably actually check to see who's next on my list, because I always keep forgetting. I think next week we're actually going to, let me just quickly check here. I believe we are going to Brazil with my friend Michelle, but let's have a look here. Let me just see here. So, oh yes, so next week we have Michelle Valim, who is going to be joining us from, I believe, Sao Paulo. And Michelle, this is Rio de Janeiro, I should say. And Michelle is actually a queer practitioner of various different neo-pagan traditions, and with a little bit of connection with some of the Brazilian spiritist movement down there. So for those of you who are checking this out as this comes out, join us next week on Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Michelle and I will be pre-recording it, of course. And thank you so much for coming for today. And thank you, Chris, for joining me for these past 3 hours that we've actually been chatting. So
yeah, it's gone fast, hasn't it? Yeah. No, it's been great. It's been great to hear, Ben. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you.